specifically Exodus 13, Exodus 14, and Numbers 33, putting it together. I don't think you can exactly prove that they walk through the Red Sea during the last day of unleavened bread, but I do kind of think it's pretty clear, and I'll show you some scriptures. Now they went through by night. So after they had rested on the last day of unleavened bread is when they entered after Moses had parted the water. So, and I'll just go through this real fast so we can get to the other subjects. Christina, did you want to go over what you found first?
No, because it might take a while.
Okay, so I will hurry. I will hurry, and
No,
then
no,
that
don't
way.
worry.
No, I don't think this will take this long, but I do think it's important to kind of go over the last day of unleavened bread. So again, so I think if you go to Exodus 14:1, so after they left Ramses, they camped at Sukkah, and then from Sukkah they went to Etham, and then from Etham to Migdal. So there's 5 nights in there. So we know they walked out of Egypt at evening on the first day of unleavened bread. So, so, and he talks about all that, like I said, in those chapters. And when you come to Exodus 14, verse 1, it says, Now Yahusha spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel that they turn and camp before Pi Hatharath between Migdal and the sea. So that was their last stop, Migdal. Um, Opposite Baal Zephon, you shall camp before it by the sea. So what y'all did, and I think that's the daylight portion, or the evening they came up and they kept the last day of unleavened bread. So they were surrounded by mountains, and then the sea's in front of them, and then eventually they're going to see the Egyptian army chasing them down. So they're trapped, and y'all did that on purpose. So I don't think they saw the Egyptians coming till around sundown. So if you so that path is in Exodus 12 verses 37 to 42. It gives you where they went from Ramses, and then it ends on 14, Exodus 14 verse 1, where it looks like they kept the daylight portion of the last day of unleavened bread. And then if you read through all this, it tells you what happened there. And then verse 10, when Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. So they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to Yah. And then this is when they complain, were there no graves in Egypt? Why did you bring us out here? And then verse 13, Moses said, Do not be afraid, stand still. There was nowhere for them to run, right? And y'all did that on purpose. Moses said, Stand still and see the salvation of Yah, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall see again no more forever. And Yah will fight for you, and he shall hold your peace. So, and then it goes on out. And then verse 19, it talks about the angel of Yah who went before the camp of Israel, moved and went behind them, and the pillar of cloud went from before them and stood behind them. So it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel. And the cloud and darkness was to the one, to Egypt, and it gave light by night to the other. So by night is when they crossed over. So the one did not come near the other all that night. So Yah blocked them. And during that night, he stretched out his hand over the sea. And then, so the children of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, and the waters were a wall to them on their right and on their left. And then the Egyptians pursued them. And then now it came, and here's ye a key of timing, verse 24. And now it came to pass in the morning watch. So that's from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. is the morning watch. That Yah basically troubled the army of the Egyptians. He took off their chariot wheels, so they drove them with difficulty. And then by the next morning, verse 27, and Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. When the morning appeared, the sea returned to its full depth, while the Egyptians were fleeing into it. So, and then verse 28, the waters returned and covered the chariots, the horsemen, and all the army of Pharaoh that came into the sea after them, and not so much as one remained. So all that happened. Um, and then Hebrews 11, 28, 29. I think we read that last time. Let me just read that real fast. And it talks about by faith, talking about Moses kept the Passover and the sprinkling of the blood, lest he who destroyed the firstborn should touch them. And then verse 29, by faith they passed through the Red Sea as by dry land, whereas the Egyptians attempting to do so were drowned. Okay, so the last day of unleavened bread represents the children of Israel's baptism. And we'll go to a scripture. I think you guys already know all that. And it represented that they had physically, completely, and spiritually left Egypt. That's what it symbolically represents. I'm not saying all of them have or had, because some of them carried idols the whole way. But with our walk with Yah, it represents coming out of sin, and then Egypt or the world or sin is completely destroyed from us. And then we're baptized, and then our next step would be to enter the covenant with Yah. Right after baptism, you enter that covenant. So, and it also means that we are to live by faith in newness of life and righteousness. So, baptism speaks of the death of Yahusha is represented by that baptism, that we also die symbolically with the baptism and then raise up in newness of life, walking in his ways, right? Which is also represented by the completion of the days of unleavened bread. Come out of sin and fully and be cleansed. And that's in 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 14, where Paul just straight up says it. So, and it says, moreover, brethren, I do not want you to be unaware that all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea. This is speaking of the sea crossing. All were baptized into Moses in the cloud and the sea. All ate the same spiritual food. All drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Yahusha. So, and then with them Elohim was not well pleased, for their bodies were scattered in the wilderness. Now these things became our examples, to the intent that we should not lust after evil things as they also lusted. So, and it goes on, but it's clear here that he's speaking of their baptism, right? With the waters covered.
Missy,
Yeah.
could you could you please give the address on that? Somehow I missed it.
Oh, yeah, no problem. 1 Corinthians 10, verses 1 through 14. So it describes what was going on there as their baptism, and then it proves that the Elohim that was with them that whole time was Yahusha. that rock that followed them was Yahusha. And that's 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4. Interesting that it's first verse 4. And then also this baptism, and I'll just give you these other scriptures and about baptism. Romans 6, 1 through 18 is great to read with it. Colossians 2:12, Hebrews 6:2. And then I'll also read 1 Peter 3:21. He references back to it as well. Again, that's 1 Peter 3:21. So, and we'll start in verse 20. It says, who formerly were disobedient once the divine long suffering waited in the days of Noah. Here we are compared to the days of Noah, while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is, 8 souls, were saved through water. So that was a type of baptism as well. And then verse 21, there is also an antitype which now saves us. Baptism, not the removal of the filth of the flesh, but the answer of a good conscience toward Yah through the resurrection of Yahushua HaMashiach. So he's comparing there the baptism of the earth through water, which also is the ancient Israelites coming through the Red Sea, is the type of baptism. And then what Peter is saying here is basically likens our baptism to the flood, like I said, and also ancient Israel coming through the Red Sea and coming out. We're saved by Yahushua's death, which is represented by our baptism, and then resurrection to a circumcised heart, right? Raised in newness of life.
I just wanted to point out that 1 Peter 3:21, the 21 points to the 21st day too.
Wow, yeah. There you go.
Okay, so keep going. Thanks, Mitzi.
Yeah, and I'm trying to hurry here. And the Colossians 2:12 also points to this, that our baptism, their baptism, is about being buried with Yahusha in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the working of Elohim, who raised him from the dead. So them coming out of the Red Sea was like being raised with Yahusha, right? To newness of life, to completely walk with Yahusha by his laws. And then later, of course, they're going to enter the covenant. So all that's so beautiful. And then you guys might have already noticed this, but I had another wow. So if you take the 7 days of unleavened bread and align it to the menorah, of course his resurrection day is that fourth day, Rod. It's just this, it's unbelievable, his patterns. Just wanted to throw that out there.
And then, and additionally, the verse 21 in chapter 14, Moses stretched out his hand, and this is caused the sea to go back and a strong east wind and all that night. This is referring to the 21st. It's the night of the 21st too.
Yes.
And so like stretched out arm is Yahusha's arm. It's always his protection over us.
Right. Isn't that beautiful?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I just got a couple more scriptures. Speaking of the resurrection of Yahusha, when we come up from baptism, when they came out of the sea. So, and then when the ark rested on dry ground again, you can tie all those things together. Let's see. John 14:19. I thought this was beautiful. And basically, it's the second half of the verse there. John 14:19. And there's scriptures all over the place, but so it says, because, and this is Yahusha speaking, because I live, you will live also. So without his death and resurrection, we have no life. But because of his death and resurrection, that these days of unleavened bread and Passover point to, because he lives, we will live also. And then I've got 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15:17. And it says, if Yahusha is not risen, your faith is futile. You are still in your sins. So that coming up, and we live through his life, basically. And then I also have Matthew 4:4, which also reminds me of the days of unleavened bread always. And you guys know what that is. But this is the life, what Yahushua is saying, by because I live, you live. But he answered and said, it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of Yahweh. So that is our bread, right? He embodied, he was the word of Yahweh, and he came as bread. His flesh was bread indeed. And if you don't feed on my flesh and drink my blood, you have no part with me. So it just all keeps pointing back to each other. And then that, of course, is in Deuteronomy 8:3. Matthew 4:4 is a quoting of Deuteronomy 8:3. And then one more, I have Romans 13. 11 through 14. And of this, knowing the time, and now it is high time to awake out of sleep, for now our salvation is nearer when we were first believed. Wait, Romans 13, is that right? 11 through 14. So therefore, let us cast off the works of darkness and let us put on the armor of light. And we talked about the darkness and light this past. Let us walk properly as in the day, not in revelry or drunkenness, not in lewdness or lust, not in strife and envy, but put on Yahushua HaMashiach and make no provision for the flesh to fulfill its lust. So that's also pointing to coming up out of baptism and how to live, putting on his life, his body, and living by faith. But anyway, I thought that was really neat, just pointing to that baptism and the fulfillment of coming out of this world and turning your back on the world at the end. Hey, do you guys go ahead and let Christina go, and then we want to talk about when the sun goes down, when unleavened bread ends, so everybody's clear on what they need to do until first fruits. Do y'all want to go over that?
That'd be great. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So, Linda, you discovered, I forgot the name of it already. Dextrose.
I think you should.
Yeah, so I don't even know why I looked into it. I think it was just for whatever reason. It was an ingredient and I wanted to know what dextrose was. And it's a sugar that supposedly is chemically like the same thing as glucose within our bodies, but it's derived from wheat and corn. So for the next few, starting this evening, down until first fruits, we're supposed to avoid all grains. So since that's a derivative of a grain, just a heads up for people that
Yeah.
are being really strict about it.
Yeah. Okay, so
Can you repeat
we'll
that
go-
real quick?
Dextrose, it comes from corn or wheat. So just look for that ingredient in your when you're eating and avoiding grains for the next 4 days.
Thank you.
So let's go to Leviticus 23, verse 14. So this is the explanation when unleavened bread ends at sundown, and then what is it, 5 days until the 26th day of the first month, which is first fruits or the wave sheaf of barley. So what this means is the wave sheaf, we'll start in verse 11, Leviticus 23, verse 11. So it says, all right, so unleavened bread ends at verse 8. So that's the last day of unleavened bread, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. That's today. And then Yah keeps speaking to Moses, and he says, okay, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when you come into your land, which I give you to reap its harvest, you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. And that is the barley harvest, and it's literally a sheaf of barley that's cut, and then it's waved before Yahweh, a wave offering, meaning it's not burnt or anything, it's just waved before him. And verse 11 gives us the instructions. He shall wave the sheaf before Yahweh to be accepted on your behalf on the day after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it. So we have our Sabbath that occurs after unleavened bread is over, and the following day, which would be day 1 of the week, they wave that barley sheaf. And you shall offer on that day when you wave the sheaf a lamb of the first year without blemish as an offering to Yah. It's grain offering, and it goes on. And its drink offering shall be wine, 1/4 of a hin. And he said, okay, here's the instructions for us. Verse 14, you shall not eat bread, nor parched grain, nor fresh grain. So remember, during unleavened bread, we couldn't eat leavened bread, but we replaced it with unleavened bread. But now you can have no bread, leavened or unleavened, parched grain or fresh grain, meaning old grain, old roasted grain, or new grain. And it says, no, you can have no grains or bread whatsoever until the same day that you have brought an offering to your Elohim. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations in all your dwellings. So from sundown this evening through the waving of that barley sheaf, that's the first day after the Sabbath, the next Sabbath after these days, no grain. And grain means wheat, barley, oats, corn, rice. What am I missing? Mullet. Whatever's in Ezekiel's bread.
Mullet's a haircut.
Mullet's a haircut.
Ritz.
Wait,
No, that's corn.
can we?
Wait,
wanna-
Jess has a question.
So I just wanted to mention, so I was looking at this, at the words in Blue Letter Bible. And so the word for, oh, where is it? So it says, nor green ears. The word is Carmel. And so it said plantation, garden land, orchard. It also said fruit orchard. And then it had fruit/garden growth. So I just, not that I want to make anything more restrictive, but I was wondering if anyone had looked at that, and do we think that it should include fruit?
That's a great point, Jess. I had not looked into that.
I was wondering, I couldn't hardly hear, but it said fruit, or is it the fruit of the ground?
It says, I want to pull it up again. It's
Because I'm
the word is Carmel. It's H3759. If you want to just like look it up. I mean, I can look it up too.
Yeah, we can look it up, but I tend to think it's grain
I
because
do too.
yeah.
Yeah, because it says, okay, it's fruitful field. So I don't think it's meaning literal fruit. It just means like a ripe harvest, or like a.
That's what I was wondering. But I just want to make sure.
Yeah, no, I am so glad for you bringing it. I mean, it gave me a scare. I'm not gonna lie, but I think it's to be learned. Yeah,
There was also something I think I read in Nehemiah this morning where they were talking about not eating like from the fruit trees. That might,
the first 3 years they're not supposed to.
yeah.
I'll dig into that some more, but I do think it means the fruitful field of the grain harvest.
Yes. I would concur with that for
Yeah,
sure.
Christina, I don't think your mute button is working, so it's okay.
Oh, that's okay.
All right. All right. Mute me when I start getting loud, okay? Because I
Okay.
don't know how to work this thing.
I know, but we don't want to stop you from like interjecting, so we're gonna let it roll.
Yeah, in all the other verses, it's fruitful field.
In context, to me it looks like grains, like fields, fruitful fields.
But I mean, there are fruits in the field.
Not your grain fields though. It's the fruit of the grain. They refer to those fruits and grains too.
And I would imagine that it's the ripened grain before the first fruits.
Yeah, usually, right. It's usually barley is the wave sheaf because a lot of times the wheat isn't even ready yet. But the point is, until you give Yah the first of the first, and barley is what usually ripens first in Palestine back then. And Yahusha was represented by the barley. And that's in Revelation when barley was considered cheaper than wheat, right? He was a slave of us all, but so he is the first of the first fruits. So that's why the barley sheaf was waved, representing Yahusha. And then Yah was saying, okay, eat no bread, eat no roasted grain, meaning old grain left over from last year, and eat no new grain until that wave sheaf is complete. And usually, and Christina, somebody else may know better, I've always heard that it's around 9 to 10 a.m. when the priest would wave that. So, I guess you could have grain again around lunchtime. But the biblical example, I think it's in Acts 20, we'll look at, they met together that evening and broke bread. So I don't know when y'all are gonna start eating again on that first day of the week after the Sabbath on the 26th. What do you guys think is fair game to start eating grain again?
Probably in the early afternoon, I would imagine. I mean, when you think about it, people, I'm sure, were starting to line up to have the priest wave their grain for them, and I'm sure it was well before evening. So I'm sure they got started once the morning services were done, because they had their morning sacrifices that they had to do. And then once those particular rituals were over, then they moved on to business.
Right. I agree.
Do we, Can we chat about the distinction between old grain and new grain? The unleavened, anything you're eating unleavened, right, during the Feast of Unleavened Bread is gonna be old grain, right? Is that the
Well, also your noodles. If you've got noodles up in your cabinet, you can't be eating on those either. That's old grain.
Yes.
well, during the week of unleavened bread is what I'm saying. I know the distinction, right, of between
Oh,
tonight and prior to first fruits.
Oh,
Before that new grain is given
yeah,
to Yahweh the proper portion, right? His portion.
yeah,
We're not to touch that. So that would mean that anything eaten during unleavened bread would have to be old grain.
correct. I agree with that.
yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Oh, this was.
And just real fast, I wanted, so, all right, is everybody understand what's expected? Any questions on that? As far as the no
that-
grain? Yeah.
So does that mean no grain or only new grain starting tonight?
No,
I mean-
so if you read Leviticus 23:14, he says no bread,
No
no old grain, no new grain, no grain whatsoever. He just went into detail. No bread, no grain, whether old or new. So I think what Yah is trying to get us to realize is we need to acknowledge He is our provider and He gives us all of our food. And to hold off and have an appreciation and bring Him the first of the first, right? And before we start consuming it again and taking it for granted, because I think his son is represented here. Like he is the creator and he's our provider. Without him, we don't have life, and without him, we don't have food either. So I think that's what y'all's trying to, if we would keep these things, we would have a better appreciation of everything he does for us.
I do have a question about on the 15th of April. Are we expected to go out and try to find barley to wave, or how should we honor that? Like, I have no idea where I'm gonna find a sheaf of barley.
Talked about this last week, and it's the priest that is required to wave the sheaf. So I keep going back to that Yahusha is our first fruit. So to me, Yahusha being in the throne room with the Father, his being there is the fulfillment. This is my interpretation. I understand people have different understandings, but I feel like I just wanted to express that I don't think that anything needs to be done on our part other than we count the days, and then we have to wait until first fruits to start eating grains again. It's my understanding.
Yeah, I agree with.
So you're saying that's a function of the priest?
It
Right.
is. It says
It says
that
it.
it is.
It says the
Priest.
priest is to do it.
Yeah. So, and then I wanted to go real fast to John 20, which is interesting, verse 26, because first fruits, the wave sheaf, is the 26th day of the first month. And I think we've talked about this before, but so Yahusha, he resurrected on the 18th of the first month, which we said is the fourth day if you put the days of unleavened bread on the menorah. And then so he was not revealed to the women until the morning of the 19th. And then he spent most of the day, the 19th, with his disciples. So with the ladies, and then he walked to Damascus with those two disciples, and then he opened their eyes when he broke the bread. I think we talked about that. But what's interesting, John 20, verse 26, it says, "And after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas was with them. Yahusha came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst, and he said, 'Peace be to you.'" Now, I believe that they were gathered together that day to keep the Feast of First Fruits. So, and it is interesting after 8 days, because if you start your count at the 19th, the day after his resurrection, when he was revealed to his disciples, then the Feast of First Fruits is the 8th day. Because I do believe that he resurrected, or he went to the Father for that week and presented himself. And then, of course, during the day, at the time the wave sheaf was offered by the priest, Yahusha would have stood before Yahweh on the sea of glass. And then that evening, he comes again and shows himself to his disciples. So I just think that's beautiful. And after the 8th day, if you go back, I forget where it is in Exodus, that all the animals that open the womb are with their mother for 7 days, and then they're offered on day 8. So
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, Dawn actually was texting with me about this, and her question was, I can go back and look at all the things that verses that she was referencing, but her question was Yahusha, did he remain here on earth because he couldn't go to the Father until he completed 7 days because he was the dead body? So, do you think that Yahusha waited to go to the throne room until first fruits? And so, I'm just thinking right now, like what you brought up, the significance of Yahusha not presenting himself until after the day. But I'm now thinking, okay, if Yahusha had to wait 7 days.
No way. He was resurrected to glory.
Okay, all right. I
Yeah.
hear, I see that point too, but I'm just thinking this is Yahusha's first appointed time, and I'm thinking he's spending it with the Father, and then
Absolutely.
yeah,
He came in the evening.
yeah, we know that, but that's what
Yeah.
I'm thinking because he wanted to spend it with the Father, like that's just
Yeah.
just a thought I'm throwing out there.
Yeah. I have it in my, I didn't want to go into this much detail, but I have it in my notes. There is proof that he ascended to the Father the evening of the 19th. And then he stayed there through first fruits. And this is the next time he appeared to them. In other words, that whole week he was with the Father.
But he presented himself to them the evening of the first day of the week when they were all together, right? Except for Thomas, right?
Yeah, it was the evening of first fruits. So he was with the Father.
No, right? He walked with the guy from Damascus, and he was with all the disciples that day, the first of the week.
On the 19th.
Right.
And that was the first of the week.
It's the first, yes, the first day of the week. Right.
Yes.
Yes.
But on the 19th, he did all that.
Yes.
And that evening, he left and went to the Father and did not come back again until the evening of first fruits.
Yeah, we don't have any scriptures outside of those 2 days. I agree.
No. Because I do believe he was with the Father. He missed the Father, and the Father missed him. But yeah, I do not think he resurrected to unclean at all. As a matter of fact, he told Mary, "Don't cling to me." He had a lot of things he wanted to get done and folks to see before he did ascend to the Father. And he basically told her that because he knew he was going that evening and would stay with the Father until he came back at John 20, verse 26. try to find that scripture that so he went back and forth a lot during that time. But then his final ascension was in Acts, and it was after 40 days after he had resurrected. And then the last 10 days is when they all saw him go up on the Mount of Olives. But I'll have to find my notes on that. I was just going to point out the two scriptures in the New Testament that prove first fruits. And I thought it was interesting too that after 8 days, and then that points to the firstborn, right? Which he was. But I'll try to find the other. And then Acts 20, which is interesting, John 20 and then Acts 20. And I think we've talked about this before too. It talks about Acts 20, verse 6. It said, "But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days joined them at Troas, where we stayed 7 days." So if you count 5 days after unleavened bread, so you get 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th, you land on first fruits. And then there you go in verse 7. Now, on the first day of the week, right, is first fruits, when the disciples came together to break bread. So now they're allowed to break bread again. Paul, ready to depart the next day, spoke to them and continued his message until midnight. So, putting that together, there's another keeping of first fruits together.